Okay, thank you, Andrei. I've started sharing my screen. Let's put the presentation in full screen. Hope you can see it.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so without further ado, first I will talk to you about the motivation behind why I created this flow. And then I'll walk you through what FIPS is, why it's important to have it, what the configuration process is, and we'll also have a short demo. Now, let's start with the motivation. Usually when I have a new configuration type to do or a new task that I haven't done before, I scan the steps what are required in order to perform that task. Now, usually when I see that the steps are not a simple step 1, click here, step 2, click there, step 3, click there, it becomes a problem for that task itself. I'm expecting complications. If in the steps I notice that I have to do some console commands, I automatically envision that it's going to be a very complicated task. The task itself may not be complicated, but because the steps at an initial scan seem very difficult to perform, the expectation is that the task is complicated. With that in mind, I said, okay, if we can make the whole process simple to do without compromising, then this is a must. So the main motivation behind creating this flow is to make the process as simple as possible without compromising the underlying solution. As I mentioned, the agenda for today is going to be talking a bit about what is FIPS, why OO needs FIPS, a short rundown on how it is recommended to configure FIPS manually. What is the difference between the manual configuration and the method I'm proposing by using HPE OO Flows? I'm going to talk about the supported deployments and about some of the choices that have been made in the flow. We'll have a quick demo I have prepared for you, central install that I am going to make FIPS compliant. We're going to talk a bit about the flows that are being used, some key aspects to take into consideration, both about, let's say, living with a FIPS compliant install and what is the future for this particular content pack. We will also have some resources in this slide that are going to be presented to you. So more details about FIPS and the link where you will be able to obtain the content pack. And at the end, also we will have a consolidated Q&A session. At every point, if you have questions, feel free to ask. I'll try to answer them as we go along as well. Okay, so what is FIPS? FIPS stands for the Federal Information Processing Standard. This is a US government computer security standard used to accredit cryptographic modules. The current version of FIPS has been approved by the US government in 2002. And currently in 2015, they started discussing about updating to FIPS 140-3. Basically, the 140 is the order of the day. So in the day that this standard was proposed, it was the 140th topic on the discussion agenda. And the -2 means that it is the second version of this standard. So basically, this has been updated in 2002 to its current standard. Now, FIPS in itself has several levels of compliance. Level 1 is mostly concerned with the software part. So that means that in order for a solution to be level 1 compliant, the solution must meet certain criteria. So we're talking about encryption algorithms, hash keys, hash key strength, and these need to be sufficiently secure in order to handle this data. For levels 2, 3, and 4, we're talking about the hardware part of the solution. So, for instance, for level 2, in order for a solution to be compliant, it must first have the software be level 1 compliant, and then it must also have some hardware-based encryption components. Crypto cards, biometric scanner, and these hardware-based mechanisms also need to log eventual trespassing situations. For level 3, then we are talking about further increasing the security. Logging into the solution can only be done through biometrics. The logging and tracing capabilities of the hardware need to be increased, and so on. For level 4, then we're talking about even the persons working on the solution need to be accredited to work on FIPS. So even the persons themselves need to be accredited. They must pass background checks. They must be residents or citizens of the United States. So basically, it gets very complicated. Now, the base requirement for FIPS 140-2 is the level 1, which we are going to talk about because that level refers to the software solution. As I said, the purpose of FIPS is to specify security requirements that will be satisfied by the cryptographic module. Okay, now why OO and FIPS? Why is this required? So first, let's talk about a bit of history. Starting with version OO 1020, we are officially certified. So FIPS is officially FIPS 140-2 compliant. Well, why exactly do we need that? So we have HPE OO, which can handle a great number of scenarios. It can orchestrate and automate a lot of scenarios. Now, if we want to use HPE OO and work on a US government program or for a company that works for the US government, then we can do it. We cannot do it because if we are not certified to be compliant with this standard, we cannot be trusted that we are handling information in a secure method. Once we have this certification, all is green lit and we can proceed to work with the United States government. Now, the certification can take anywhere from 6 months to 1 year to complete. Basically, the certification steps are that once we have the software solution able to utilize the crypto standards from FIPS, we provide them to an independent certification body, which runs a series of tests and provides in time the verdict, either yes, the solution matches the criteria, or if needed, where exactly you need to improve. Now, one example of a weird scenario where FIPS is actually not exactly used for the US government itself. Back when there was the problem with Hurricane Katrina, a lot of people needed to access their insurance details to get compensation for the damages of the hurricane. Now, all the actions related to Hurricane Katrina were handled by FEMA, which is a US government organization. Now, some companies decided, hey, look, we are going to make an aggregated application that will have data, will mine data from all the insurance players, so all the insurance companies in the area, and basically the people will need to go to one single location and submit their details, get their information in order to speed up the whole process. Now, because the whole action regarding the relief for Hurricane Katrina was under the umbrella of FEMA, this suddenly became a US government interaction. So basically, this aggregator site needed to prove that it's FIPS compliant, even though it wasn't actually accessing government secrets or accessing any government-related files. Basically, the only thing that is the relationship between that aggregated site and the government was that for that period of time, FEMA was in charge. So this means that even if I'm not working directly on government data, there are cases where I need to be FIPS compliant. Okay, so we've talked about FIPS, we've talked about why we need it, and, well, how do we do it? So for 1020, the steps are a bit simpler, but starting with 1050 and moving forward, there are some extra steps. In order to provide the bigger picture going further, I'm going to include all the extra steps and mention when the step is not necessary for 1020. For instance, downloading the Oracle JDK. Starting with OO 1050, we have moved from Oracle JDK to OpenJDK. Now, in order to be FIPS compliant, we need to use Oracle JDK. The OpenJDK is not certified. Now, this is another key aspect that we need to stress. Even if a certain software component allows us to utilize all the cryptography standards from FIPS, so from the standard, if that particular solution has not been certified, it's as if it's not compliant. So currently, only Oracle Java is compliant. The OpenJDK products, even if they're using, let's say, a straight copy of Oracle, they're not compliant because they are not certified. So the first step is to download Oracle JDK. Then we need to download the extended the Java cryptography extension, or the unlimited JCE as they call it. Pay special attention that in 1020 we are using Java version 7. In 1050 and later we are using Java 8. So these extensions are also version specific. So if you are using Java 7, download the version of JCE for Java 7. If you're using Java 8, download the JCE version for Java 8. Now, For 1050 and onward, we need to replace the OpenJDK with the Oracle JDK. So we need to replace the Java files that are provided with the OO install. Then we need to install the JCE in OO's JDK. This sounds a bit more complicated than it really is in reality. Installing the JCE simply means that we need to copy 2 jars into the Java lib security folder. I'll show this to you in the demo. Okay, once we have done that, we start editing config files. We need to update the Java security file to configure the new JCE and in relation FIPS compliant cryptography providers. We need to install the cryptography jars. So the actual jars that are going to be using these providers. These jars are located in the OO install lib folder. So both in the central lib and in the RAS lib. But because these are not used in regular installs, these need to be provided manually into the Java folder. We need then to harden all encryption properties. So we need to change in the encryption properties the encryption algorithm and the key size in order to be FIPS compliant. Generate new OO encryption keys that match the new encryption properties. So for central, we need to also generate a new encrypted DB password, because the DB password is encrypted in the configuration files, and that DB password also needs to be safe and needs to be encrypted with the new keys. Replace the old DB password in the configuration files, start OO service, and we are done. Okay, these are the steps to do it manually. Now, how exactly does the flow help us in this case? Well, there are some things which, from a security standpoint and from a technical standpoint as well, we are not allowed to do. So downloading the Oracle JDK and the Oracle JCE from a technical standpoint, it's next to impossible, because Oracle has this system with accepting their license agreement, which generates a temporary download link, which expires in something like 2 or 3 hours, maybe less. And it has some random hashing inside, so we cannot predict what the link will look like, which means that we cannot download both the JDK and JCE from the Oracle site. In order to download this, we will need to switch to third-party sites which are not trusted, which are not reliable. Yes, most likely they have not been tampered with, but we have no way of knowing. So from both a technical and a security aspect, these 2 steps cannot be automated. The same for replacing OJDK and installing the JCE, since these tasks could be construed as, okay, I've downloaded them manually, I provide you with the location, all you need to do is copy them from that location. Again, from a security standpoint, this is not acceptable, because there are some scenarios in which a compromised system might modify them before I can trigger the flow. So even when using the flows, these 4 steps still need to be done manually. But after these 4 steps are completed, That's it. We start the configuration flow, wait for a short period of time, and then once it's complete successfully, simply start OO service. By that, simplifying quite a lot the whole configuration and the whole process. Now, what are the supported deployments for this flow? We support both Linux and Windows installations. So we actually have flows specifically targeting both Linux and Windows. Therefore, wherever you can install Windows or wherever you can install OO Central or RAS, the flow can be used to make the install compliant. Now, during the flow, you can only configure either a standalone Central or a standalone RAS. What this means is that in the installation flow, in the install folder that we provide to the flow, we need to have only either Central or RAS. Studio is not relevant for this discussion, but we need to have either only Central or only RAS. If in that install folder we have both Central and RAS, one of the components is in illegal state. Now, why I'm saying this? In order to configure FIPS, OO Central needs to be on a clean install, and also needs to never have started. So during installation, there is an option not to start Central, and this must be checked in order for the FIPS compliance process to work. Why this is necessary is because OO stores a number of encrypted values in its database. So the passwords for the key stores, for example, are stored encrypted in the database. Any system accounts, so internal OO system accounts, are stored encrypted. Any password, content, inputs, outputs, there are a whole lot of encrypted data in the table. Now, one of the steps required for FIPS is exactly to change the encryption key. So if we have a Central that has already run and has populated the DB with all this encrypted data, we cannot modify the key and hope that everything will still work. So in order for this to work, we need to have no data in the DB. Simply installing Central and starting it up will populate the DB with configuration data, with encrypted keys, and therefore it will render our work impossible. So for Central to be configured, it has to be brand new. It never run before. On the other hand, if we are installing on a cluster node, so we need a cluster install, again, that node needs to be clean. It needs to never have started. But in order to install a cluster Central and make it compliant, the first thing we need to do is install the first node, make it compliant, start it up, and then we need to install the second node and make that one compliant, and so on and so forth. Now, for us, the problem is, why I'm saying that one of the components. Okay, so let's assume that Central is stopped. Then the RAS needs to be connected to something. The RAS cannot be connected to that Central. So the only logical explanation is that the RAS from that folder, we don't know exactly to what Central it's connected. If we don't know, we can assume that it's connected to a Central that is not hardened. And therefore, once hardening the RAS, we won't be able to use it anymore. So in the case where Central and RAS are on the same folder. We just don't know, and it's best not to touch that kind of install because one of the components may be in an illegal state. Now, during the flow, we constantly perform operating system detections to verify what we are using. In order to not have requirements of installing third-party tools or have something like port scanners, which can fail, can lead us to have false positive, we are using remote command execution. So we are basically attempting to reach components that are available only for Windows or only for Linux. In the case of Windows, we are using remote command execution over WMI to attempt to connect to PowerShell. And this requires us that the flows are always run from a Windows worker. Now, because of the aforementioned limitation that Central must not have started, this also means that I cannot use the flow from the Central I'm trying to harden. And the lowest footprint for running this flow is Studio. So we recommend that the flow be triggered from Studio because, okay, Studio is a lightweight install. Once you're done, you can uninstall it or you will need it further for authoring purposes. And also Studio at this time is not part of the hardening process. And now I've prepared, as I mentioned, a short demo. I have Central installed. So ahead of time, I have installed a Central that has not yet started. And this is basically a Central of version 10.60. It has not been modified, so let's proceed with the steps I have mentioned. So before the meeting, I have also downloaded the Oracle JDK and the JCE files. So let's start by backing up our Java. And this is very important in case, so for every step of the way, we are creating backups so that in case everything fails, we can return to that perfect scenario where all is brand new. Okay, so I'm not going to need the old files, they are backed up. I'm going to copy the new files into Java, basically installing the Oracle 8 JDK. Now we need to back up the local policy and the US export policy, which these two jars are basically the JCE files that I mentioned earlier. Copy the FIPS compliant JCE files and override the old ones. And that's it for the manual part. Now, the flow itself does not need to run from the same VM that I am configuring, and it's perfectly capable of running from a remote host. Okay. In order to minimize a lot of the variables that are needed, The only thing which we need to provide the flow are the host on which it will run. So a username capable of running commands on that host. So a username with administrator privileges. Where OO is installed on the host, and the DB password. So this is the DB password for the OO user, not the master DB password. As I mentioned, so it checks exactly what files, what it needs to handle, and it starts working to modify the configuration files. It starts copying the jars. Basically, the flow doesn't take long to run. For each file that it needs to modify, it's going to create a backup. So at any time, even after we are done and the flow is successful, if we change our mind, it's no problem. We have backups. We can restore the original files. Okay, it's almost done, and it completed successfully. Okay, as I mentioned, so let's look at some of the files that have been modified by the flow. So in the security, we have the modified Java security file and the old Java security file. In the Java security file, as we can see, new providers have been added, and the old ones have been modified in order not to have conflicts in the file. And we can see the old file in which the providers are not available. So in the old file, we have 10 security providers. In the new one, we have 12. We then have some modified, some added variables, which again, in the original file, we don't. The same is true for any file that we needed to modify. So for instance, the central conf DB properties, again, we have the new file with the password encrypted with the new key. And we have the old file with the old encryption. So as you can see, already we have different encryption. Now, all that's left for us is to start the central. This may take a while. So while this is starting, let's talk about the flow for a bit. So as I mentioned before, we only provide the install path, and the flow needs to know exactly what's installed in the OO folder. So it gets the components, the installed components, Central, Studio, RAS, and then it can make the decision whether it has to configure a Central or a RAS. If it has to configure Central, which is our case now, as you saw, I need to handle a lot of files from different paths. I'm generating these paths based on the install path provided. So I'm generating all the paths for the Java security, for the database properties, for the encryption. Every path that needs to be handled is generated for both Windows and Linux, depending on the detected OS. Then it's copying the crypto files from O. So in the O folder, under the central lib, we have these jars called crypto.jce, crypto.jcommon, and JCM FIPS, which need to be copied to the Java libxt folder. Now, in 10.60, these jars were upgraded to a newer version that has been certified and is compliant. The flow will know we don't need to provide the O version to detect exactly what's going on. The flow will know to copy the correct files based on what it finds in the install path. Then it moves on to modify the Java security file, modify the encryption properties file, replace the encryption, and then it replaces the DB password in the database properties file. Now, this replacement of the DB password is a twofold step. It generates the new password and then replaces it in the file. For us, it's quite simpler. Again, it generates its paths, it copies the crypto files, modifies the Java security, modifies the encryption properties, and replaces the encryption key. For us, we don't need to focus on database password because it doesn't use it. Okay, so the central install, from what I see, is still starting up. Usually for the first startup, it takes a while longer. Okay, let's see. Okay, from what I see, Central just finished starting up. Okay, and as we can see, Central started up. It's fully functional, so the configuration was successful. Okay, now let's talk about the key aspects, both of the content and, as I call it, living with a FIPS compliant OO install. The main thing to take into account here is, as I said, that every component that makes a solution needs to be FIPS compliant. So if OO is FIPS compliant, but we integrate OO with another application that is not compliant, then the entire solution will not be compliant. Another key aspect is the part about certificates. Now, if we harden on OO install to be FIPS compliant, the security aspect of the certificates, so central and RASA certificates, becomes slightly more complicated in that the future certificates, so if my OO certificates expire, the certificates with which I'm going to replace these also need to be FIPS compliant. This means that they also need to be generated using an encryption method, so an encryption algorithm and an encryption key that fits what is used by OO. So if we use different certificate types, we will get an error. So moving forward, after OO is FIPS compliant, when replacing the certificates, we need to take some extra care. Do note that this does not relate to the public certificates, so the chaired PEM certificates that need to be added into the client trustor in order to trust a specific endpoint. For those, we don't have any limitation. What I'm talking about here is the exact certificates for the OO component. So central certificate and RASA certificate. Now, moving forward to the content that is provided, there is currently one limitation that in case the flow fails, it does not roll back the changes it's made. So currently, during the testing phase, we didn't encounter enough situations where the flow would fail in order to justify creating the rollback mechanism. So one of the things we plan on, I plan on doing in the future is based on feedback. If there is a need for this rollback mechanism to implement it and have, let's say, more safety when talking about failures of the flow. Another part of this rollback mechanism is the reporting mechanism. So basically, if the flow fails, to report either via email or displaying a message exactly what component failed, and then move to a hard failure. The flow currently, if it fails at any point, it will not continue headlessly. It will stop with a hard failure. And the last enhancement, or let's say future plan, is obviously to improve. So currently the configuration method is the one that it is at this time in effect. If this configuration or hardening method changes, I will also update the content to reflect this change, and also have, I call them performance enhancement. What performance enhancements means is that later on, if there is going to be content that's better suited to handle any part of the flow, for instance, I'm creating the new files using remote command execution, which is not exactly the neatest way to do it, but it's a method that works. So in the future, if content that allows remote file management becomes available, I will replace the remote command executions to utilize the remote file management. So this is what I mean by performance enhancement. If there is going to be a better way to do it, I will update to the better way. Now, I've included the HPLN location where this content pack is going to be available. Most likely, it's going to become publicly available at the end of the month, and a link to drill down into more details about FIPS and its history. With that being said, thank you, and I will open the stage for questions.
Okay, if you guys don't have any questions, then we will close the session. Thank you, Vlad, very much for the cool presentation. Thank you guys for being present here with us today. We will be able to upload the recording of the webinar in YouTube pretty soon, hopefully by tomorrow end of day. See you again in 1 month. It's going to be 16 August, if I recall. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye.